before you three historical figures as part of the Fusion Fest. These historical figures are known as great world leaders of their time. Let us explore the leadership qualities and moral ideals they demonstrated during their political life. We present before you our first historical figure, the great Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar. This is the claim that Augustus makes. I inherited it brick and left it marble. The it here refers to the great Roman Empire that he created. This map depicts the area of the Roman Empire during his reign. The yellow colored areas are the ones which he inherited from his predecessors. The green ones are the ones which he added through conquest during his reign. And the pink ones are the client states of Rome. Which means that they have their own ruler, but they have to pay tribute to Rome every year and have to provide Rome with an army in times of need. Augustus is the first Roman emperor. That is because Augustus was the first one after 750 years to diminish the powers of the Senate and concentrate power to himself. He did great and good things for Rome, but at what cost? Let us watch a video that depicts the pros and cons of this leader, Augustus.
His reign marked the beginning of one of history's greatest empires and the end of one of its first republics. Was Rome's first emperor a visionary leader who guaranteed his civilization's place in history, or a tyrant who destroyed its core values? Find out in History versus Augustus.
Order. The defendant today is Gaius Octavius?
Gaius Julius Caesar.
Do we have the wrong guy?
No, Your Honor. Gaius Octavius, born in 63 BCE, was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. He became Gaius Julius Caesar upon being named his great-uncle's adoptive son and heir. And he gained the title Augustus in 27 BCE, when the Senate granted him additional honors. You mean when he established sole authority and became Emperor of Rome?
Is that bad? Didn't every place have some king or emperor back then?
Actually, Your Honor, the Roman people had overthrown their kings centuries before to establish a republic. A government meant to serve the people, not the privilege of a ruling family. And it was Octavius who destroyed this tradition. Octavius was a model public servant. At 16, he was elected to the College of Pontiffs that supervised religious worship. He fought for Rome in Hispania alongside his great-uncle Caesar, and took up the responsibility of avenging Caesar's death when the corrupt oligarchs in the Senate betrayed and murdered him. Caesar had been a power-hungry tyrant who tried to make himself a king while consorting with his Egyptian queen Cleopatra. After his death, Octavius joined his general Mark Antony in starting a civil war that tore Rome apart, then stabbed his ally in the back to increase his own power. Antony was a fool. He waged a disastrous campaign in Parthia and plotted to turn Roman territories into personal kingdoms for himself and Cleopatra.
Isn't that what Caesar had been accused of?
Well,
So Octavius destroyed Antony for trying to become a king and then became one himself?
that's right. You can see the megalomania even in his adopted title, the illustrious one. That was a religious honorific. And Augustus didn't seek power for his own sake. As winner of the Civil War and commander of the most troops, it was his duty to restore law and order to Rome so that other factions didn't continue fighting. He didn't restore the law, he made it subordinate to him. Not true. Augustus worked to restore the Senate's prestige, improved food security for the lower classes, and relinquished control of the army when he resigned his consul post. Mere optics. He used his military influence and personal wealth to stack the Senate in his favor, while retaining the powers of a tribune and the right to celebrate military triumphs. He kept control of provinces with the most legions, and if that wasn't enough, he assumed the consul position twice more to promote his grandchildren. He was clearly trying to establish a dynasty.
But what did he do with all that power?
Glad you asked, Your Honor. Augustus's accomplishments were almost too many to name. He established consistent taxation for all provinces, ending private exploitation by local tax officials. He personally financed a network of roads and employed couriers so news and troops could travel easily throughout the realm. And it was under Augustus that many of Rome's famous public buildings were constructed. The writers of the time were nearly unanimous in praising his rule. Did the writers have any other choice? Augustus exiled plenty of people on vague charges, including Ovid, one of Rome's greatest poets. And you forgot to mention the intrusive laws regarding citizens' personal lives, punishing adultery, restricting marriage between social classes, even penalties for remaining unmarried. He was trying to improve the citizenry and instill discipline, and he succeeded. His legacy speaks for itself. 40 years of internal stability, a professional army that expanded Rome's frontiers in all directions, and a government still remembered as a model of civic virtue. His legacy was an empire that would go on to wage endless conquest until it collapsed, and a tradition of military autocracy. Anytime a dictator in a general's uniform commits atrocities while claiming to act on behalf of the people, we have Augustus Caesar to thank.
So you're saying Augustus was a good emperor, and you're saying there's no such thing.
We're used to celebrating historical leaders for their achievements and victories, but to ask whether an individual should have such power in the first place is to put history itself on trial. Check out this playlist for more
Is Augustus Caesar a good leader? Shouldn't he respect the freedom of his people? This usurping of republic by monarchy has come down to us as glorious, because history was manipulated by Augustus to glorify himself. For example, coins, statues, monuments, and even his tomb was designed by him to glorify him. He paved the way for a culture of autocracy. Now let us move 2000 years ahead to the contemporary era where democracy is prevalent. And let's take a look at how leadership looks in the country that claims to be the earliest democracy in the modern world.
Hence we present before you Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, the man who saved the free world. If not for him, we would have a different model of the free world today. He was Great Britain's wartime Prime Minister, a great influential orator, and a Nobel Prize winner, and one of history's greatest politicians. A man of great valor, bravado, and charisma. People of Britain at that time needed support, reassurance, and help. Winston Churchill offered it. He promised them victory, they promised him power, and thus the duo won the war. Now, we are going to look at a video which talks about his glorious political career.
In May 1940, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi war machine were sweeping across the European continent. The future of the free world hung in the balance. An isolationist-leaning United States was an ocean away. There was one man who stood between Hitler's seemingly invincible army and crushing defeat. That one man was Winston Churchill. He was born on November the 30th, 1874. Though we think of him as the quintessential Englishman, he was actually half American. His mother, Jenny, was the daughter of a wealthy New York stock speculator. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was of English nobility and a major political figure. From his early school days, Churchill recognised the power of words. Throughout his life, he used them with consummate skill. They never let him down. He first made a name for himself as a war correspondent in the 1890s, covering conflicts in Cuba, northern India, the Sudan, and South Africa. Though he never abandoned journalism and became one of the greatest historians of his age, Churchill used his family connections and his own fame to launch himself into politics. His confident manner and matchless oratory marked him as a natural leader. 1914 and World War I found him in the key position of First Lord of the Admiralty, where he did much to modernise Britain's navy. In 1915, Churchill thought he could bring a speedy end to the war by opening a new front in Turkey, which he perceived as the weak link in the German alliance against the Allies. This led to the infamous Gallipoli campaign. Badly underestimating the fighting strength of the Turks, thousands of British, Australian and New Zealand soldiers were killed in battles that proved to be every bit as indecisive and bloody as the campaigns on Europe's Western Front. Churchill took the blame. This was perhaps the low point of his life. Dismissed from the War Cabinet, 5 months later he enlisted in the army, where he saw action in France. He rose again in British politics throughout the 1920s, making money, as he always did, through his writing and speaking. As Adolf Hitler took power in Germany in the 1930s, Churchill was one of the first, and certainly the loudest voice in England, sounding the alarm. But it was an alarm few in England wanted to hear. The English had been traumatised, as had all of Europe, by the shocking amount of death and destruction of the First World War. No one wanted to face the possibility that it could happen again. Churchill, however, saw that a new confrontation with Germany was inevitable. And when the inevitable arrived, with the stunning German attack on France in May 1940, a desperate nation turned to him. He was ready. His weapons were his pen, his voice, and his words. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, he told the House of Commons in his first speech as Prime Minister. Things quickly turned from bad to worse. France collapsed, Belgium surrendered, and 250,000 British soldiers barely managed to escape from Dunkirk. Even as the war news moved from dangerous to desperate to disastrous, Churchill never wavered. In speech after speech, he infused the British with the spirit to fight on against Hitler's monstrous tyranny. We shall not flag or fail, he said after Dunkirk. We shall go on to the end. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall never surrender. The point about Churchill in 1940 is not that he stopped a German invasion, but that he stopped the British government making peace. If Churchill had not been Prime Minister, the pro-appeasement Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax would have been. We know that Halifax was open to negotiating with Hitler. We'd be mistaken to assume that the German Führer's terms would not have been reasonable. They probably would have been very reasonable, as Hitler wanted to fight a one-front war against Russia, and an agreement with Britain would have allowed him to do just that. Churchill made this impossible. Had he not rallied the British people in the face of defeat after defeat, preventing Hitler from concentrating his full efforts on Russia, the entire history of the free world would have been much different, and undoubtedly much darker. Because of Churchill's efforts and the marvellous resilience of the British people, the United States had an unsinkable aircraft carrier, Britain, from which to mount the liberation of the European continent in June of 1944. For this, and so much more, free people everywhere can thank the greatest man of his age, Winston Churchill. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University.
So, one thing which is made clear from this video is that Winston Churchill was indeed a great leader for his country. He led his people to victory in what seemed to be a doomed war. And now we're going to look at a completely different side of this great leader, the side which we never speak of, the more oppressive, the more pro-imperialist side. We're going to cite a few incidents from history to portray this. Now the Afghans and Kurds. The Afghans and Kurds were two native tribes from the Iran and Iraq region which were under the British dominion. The year was 1919 when they fought, and that year Winston Churchill was the Minister of War and Air. It was then when he authorized the use of poison gas against these so-called uncivilized tribes. 1919 was 1 year after World War I. After World War I ended, that is. And the use of gases in World War I led to many atrocities and spread a lot of unimaginable terror. Despite all of this, the fact that Winston Churchill was so willing to use poison gas against these tribes is scandalous. Now let's explore another question. Was Winston Churchill racist? Now, Churchill saw himself and the people of British origin as a higher grade race. One of the times when this is brought to the forefront is in his remarks towards the Native Americans. He said that a stronger race, a higher grade race, and a more worldly wise race has come in and took their place. He never believed that any wrong had been done to them and that it was right that they were displaced. His justification for all of this was that theirs was a savage culture and that they were bringing to them the benefits of civilization. Churchill deeply disliked any other race other than that of the people of British origin. And now we'll see this contempt towards other races translate to a horrible disaster.
The Bengal famine. So, how are famines caused? They're caused due to soil moisture deficit or crop failures. But this deadly famine was not caused due to crop failure or moisture deficit in the soil. It was caused because of one man's political will and expression, and the man behind it was Winston Churchill. There were food ships sent from Britain to India, but Winston Churchill told that these food ships be diverted to Australia where British soldiers were there. Instead of giving this food to Indians who were starving and dying, he sent this food to Australia for the British soldiers. Also, in the Calcutta port, there was a lot of food docked. But Winston Churchill told that this food will not be given to the Indians and instead will only be given to the European soldiers. He said that Indians are breeding like rabbits, so any amount of food will not be sufficient for them. He also said Indians are beastly people with a beastly religion. When some concerned officials sent reports to Churchill about the graveness of the situation in India and that how people were dying, Winston Churchill told that I can't see anything grave here or people dying. If it is so grave and if people are dying, then why isn't Gandhi dead yet? This man has the blood of 4 million people on his hands, which is equivalent to a genocidal killer like Adolf Hitler.
Now, Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler both had racist views. Both of them were killers. But why is it that one is celebrated and the other is condemned? Could the answer to this be that history is written by the victorious and for them? Another question is a good leader one who does good for his countrymen, despite the costs which the rest of the world bears, despite the costs of humanity? Now let's look at a leader of a country where freedom is highly celebrated and how he let his people down.
So that president there is Richard Nixon. He was the 27th president of the USA. He's one of the most controversial presidents in the history of USA. Due to the fact that he was the only president who was about to be impeached, but he resigned just before he could be impeached. Let's look at his career and see how did he bring it to this infamy, to this point of infamy.
On November 5, 1968, Richard Nixon was elected the 37th President of the United States.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago, and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
While in office, Nixon dealt with an unstable economy and oversaw reforms in welfare, civil rights, and more. In foreign affairs, Nixon helped end the Vietnam War, re-established contact with China, and improved relations with the Soviet Union. In 1972, Nixon was re-elected in a landslide victory. However, his undoing was already in the works.
The Democratic National Committee is trying to solve a spy mystery. It began before dawn Saturday when 5 intruders were captured by police inside the offices of the committee in Washington. The 5 men carried cameras and apparently had planted electronic bombs.
A few months prior to his re-election, a group of men linked to the Nixon administration was arrested at the Democratic Party headquarters in Washington's Watergate complex. And what followed was one of the biggest scandals in presidential history. The Watergate scandal was revealed as a cover-up by the Nixon administration to hide involvement in illegal activities against their opponents. It ultimately led to Nixon's resignation from the presidency on August 9, 1974.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body.
Nixon was granted a full pardon by the Ford administration a month later. A few years later, he was paid $600,000 by British TV personality David Frost for a string of in-depth television interviews.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition. Exactly.
Between 45 and 50 million people watched the Frost-Nixon interviews when they aired in 1977. The last decades of Nixon's life were spent rebuilding his reputation as a best-selling author, senior statesman, and foreign policy specialist. On April 22, 1994, Nixon died after suffering a massive stroke 10 months after his wife's passing. He is remembered by many as the face of the embarrassing Watergate scandal. However, Richard Nixon's contributions to world peace also helped shape his legacy.
So at the end of the day, was Nixon a good leader or a bad leader? Should he be judged for his own political ambitions or for what he did to his country?
Is Augustus a good leader despite manipulating facts to glorify himself?
Should a world leader only think about his countrymen, or should he also care about humanity?
Can we afford for world leaders to have views such as racism, however prevalent it may seem at the time? Does the society in some sense not inherit these views?
So who is a good leader? Since we ourselves don't have clarity, it's open to discussion. That's it. Does anyone have any questions regarding any of the three? Yes.
I didn't understand for what did Nixon get paid? Like it came in the video
He
somewhere.
got paid to go did the interview with Frost. So the person he did the interview with was Frost. And Frost paid him so that he comes to us.
So David Frost was he was this British journalist, as you saw in the video, who was actually losing his fame, and he was practically at the end of his career. So he thought this was a good way to rebuild his reputation. So he called Nixon up, and they had these series of debates, which you can actually you can read the transcripts or you can watch the debates online. So so Nixon agreed because he felt that it would rebuild his reputation, and so that's what it was for.
So leaders work under tremendous pressure to achieve their objectives and goals. And people sitting at the vantage point make comments without being in that situation. How is it fair?
I don't think that in this case, at least, there are mere comments. These, at least like saying that they tried their best was not enough because the costs were unimaginable.
No, they have to focus on the objective. I mean, the leader's goal is to accomplish the objective.
Is the objective right?
It's,
I mean,
is your
who says
question,
that,
no,
right?
does your
I mean,
question direct
it looks
now?
from which point of view, right? Usually the liberals talk about aggressive leaders, but liberals don't create anything. Capitalists create most of the things.
Does your question boil down to does your end justify your means? Because leader can obviously achieve his objective, but his means need to be just.
I don't think having basic using 45 million justifies. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are, how much pressure you have. Having basic people killing 45 million people cannot be justified by anything or anyone at any point in time.